I stood frozen in the doorway, the bright pink violation notice clenched tightly in my hand. Karen Thompson, the woman responsible for everything that would soon unfold, stood across from me, arms crossed with a clipboard clutched to her chest. The smile on her face never quite reached her eyes, as if she derived some sort of twisted pleasure from the power she wielded. "Rules are rules, Mr. Harrison," Karen said, her voice oozing with an unspoken sense of superiority. "Your rose bushes are 2 inches over the height limit. Pinecrest Gardens has standards to maintain." 20 years of hard work, sacrifice, and dedication had gone into building this house. My 3-story dream home, with its meticulous details and flawless execution, stood as a testament to everything I had achieved in life. The garden alone had taken 5 years to perfect, the roses my late wife had planted blooming with pride. Yet now Karen stood here, in my personal space, threatening to take it all away because of a mere 2 inches. 2 inches? I asked, incredulity lacing my voice. I looked at the immaculate roses, their vibrant colors almost mocking me in the face of this absurdity. "Can't you make an exception? These bushes are award-winning." Karen's smile tightened, but her words were unyielding. "Exceptions lead to chaos. You have 48 hours to trim them or face a $100 daily fine." She turned on her heels and marched down my cobblestone walkway, stopping to take photos of my fountain with her phone, undoubtedly for evidence that I had somehow violated the HOA's sacred rules. Something in the back of my mind told me that this wouldn't be the last time I'd encounter her, and I was right. The next morning, I found 5 more violation notices stuck to my door, each one more ludicrous than the last. Unapproved water feature, non-conforming mailbox design, excessive holiday decorations. I read them aloud, the absurdity of it all sinking in. "It's February," I muttered, holding up the notice that criticized me for excessive holiday decorations. "The only decoration is a single heart wreath I forgot to take down." My neighbor, Douglas Miller, waved at me from across the street. He crossed over, his eyes darting nervously toward Karen's house down the block. "I see she's found a new target," he said quietly. "What's her deal?" "Her deal?" I asked. "She's running for HOA president next month," Douglas explained, lowering his voice. "Every election cycle, she picks a few homeowners to terrorize to show how tough she'll be on rule breakers. It's her way of proving she can handle the job." "That's insane," I muttered. "Welcome to Pinecrest Gardens," Douglas said with a sigh. "My advice? Just comply. She made the Johnsons' lives hell until they moved out. They sold their house for way under value to her brother's development company. It was clear that I wasn't the first person she targeted, and I wouldn't be the last. I spent that afternoon trimming the rose bushes that didn't need trimming, all the while wondering why anyone would have a problem with my home, my hard work. As the sun began to set, I stood in front of my house, admiring my beautiful garden. The imported Italian fountain bubbled peacefully, my vintage Corvette gleamed in the driveway. Everything seemed perfect. Yet the next morning I was greeted with 3 more violations. Vehicle must be garaged, excessive water usage, and improper trash can placement. I felt the sting of injustice. This was no longer just about the roses. This was about Karen's campaign to make my life a living hell. I called the HOA management company. The representative on the other end of the line sounded apologetic but helpless. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrison, but all violations are verified by our inspection team. You can appeal at next month's meeting, but in the meantime, the fines will continue to accumulate." "You're kidding me," I said, frustration boiling over. I tried reasoning with Karen directly. Big mistake. The woman who answered didn't have an answer for that. 2 weeks and $1,400 in fines later, I found myself sitting in the first HOA meeting I had ever attended. I had hoped that by showing up, I could reason with the board and put an end to this madness. But as soon as I entered the small community center, I was struck by how few neighbors had bothered to come. It seemed like only a handful of people cared enough about what was happening, and none of them seemed to be in a position of power. Karen Thompson, however, sat at the board table, her influence obvious even before the meeting began. She wasn't yet the president, but I could already see that the current board members were deferring to her every word. When I stood to address the board about my violations, the president of the HOA, an elderly man with glasses and a weak handshake, interrupted me almost immediately. "Compliance first, then appeals," he said curtly, as if he had already made up his mind. I was speechless. Was this how things were going to go? Karen's grip on the board was suffocating, and it was clear that my situation wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about her and her ambitions. On my way out of the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I drove home, my mind racing with questions. Why was this happening? Why me? My house wasn't the problem. Karen was. That night, unable to sleep, I decided to dig deeper. I pulled up the property maps of Pinecrest Gardens online. My lot was the largest in the community, positioned perfectly at the entrance with unobstructed mountain views. It dawned on me that my property was a developer's dream. Prime real estate in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for future expansion. That was when the pieces began to fit together. I started looking through the HOA's past newsletters, searching for patterns. What I found shocked me. Over the past 5 years, 7 homeowners had moved out of their homes following aggressive violation campaigns. And what was even more shocking was that all 7 of these properties were now owned by Thompson Development Group, Karen's brother's company. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't about rules or regulations. This was a scheme. Karen wasn't targeting homeowners randomly. She was driving them out so that her brother could swoop in and buy their properties for a fraction of their value. It was all starting to make sense. The next day, I had my home inspected by an independent company. The results were clear. My house passed every inspection. The electrical system, plumbing, and structure were all in perfect condition. I was ready. I had to take action. When Karen showed up at my doorstep the following day with yet another violation, this time claiming that my grass was too tall, I was prepared. "You're not welcome here," I said firmly. "Selective enforcement of HOA regulations is illegal. You know that, don't you?" Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "We enforce equally, Mr. Harrison." "Really?" I said, my voice cool and steady. "Because I've documented every violation, and it seems you're the only one who's been enforcing these rules against me. I've checked. My neighbors have the same grass height, identical mailboxes, and similar fountains. So why am I the only one receiving violations?" Karen's expression tightened, her eyes narrowing with irritation. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I replied calmly. "I'm just letting you know that I'm aware of what's happening, and I'll be taking action." She left quickly, but I could feel the tension in the air. I had just taken the first step toward fighting back. For the next week I waited, wondering if I would be hit with another violation. But nothing came. I thought I had won. But as soon as I let my guard down, I received notice of an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda? A discussion of my property. I couldn't help but wonder what Karen had planned now. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following evening. I arrived early, hoping to gather information and figure out how to prepare for whatever Karen had planned. As I walked into the community center, I immediately noticed how tense the atmosphere was. Only a few neighbors had turned up, and their eyes were glued to the front, avoiding mine as I made my way to the back of the room. Karen was at the podium, her presence undeniable. Though she wasn't yet the president, it was clear she was calling the shots. Her demeanor was calm and controlled, but there was something in her eyes, a coldness that sent a chill down my spine. Behind her, a slideshow flickered to life on the screen. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Karen began, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "As you all know, the situation with Mr. Harrison's property has become a matter of urgent concern for our community. His home, with its towering structure and excessive landscaping, is ruining the character of Pinecrest Gardens. Property values are already suffering, and we need to take action." I felt my blood boil. A towering structure, excessive landscaping. It was my home, my dream. The slideshow continued, displaying pictures of my house, each photo carefully chosen to make it look out of place. And the angles were taken to exaggerate the height of my house and the size of my garden. Every detail was skewed to fit her narrative, turning my pride into an eyesore. Karen clicked to the next slide. "As you can see, Mr. Harrison's property is an anomaly. It's disrupting the harmony of our community, and if we don't act quickly, our property values will suffer. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. It was my turn to speak, and I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Actually, Karen, I began, my voice steady but firm, I'd like everyone to see something first. I walked to the podium, my hands clutching a folder of documents I had gathered over the past few days. The room fell silent as I pulled out a series of property assessments, the figures showing that my house had, in fact, increased the value of the surrounding homes by 12%. I handed copies to the board members and began flipping through photos of other homes in the neighborhood, homes with similar features to mine, none of which had received a single violation. You see, I said, pausing for effect, the truth is, my home has been an asset to this neighborhood. It has increased property values, and yet I'm the one being singled out. Why? Because of petty jealousy and personal vendettas. I've also brought copies of sales records showing how other properties targeted by the HOA sold for below market value, all of them now owned by Thompson Development Group. Karen's face drained of color. For the first time, she looked rattled. Her brother, sitting at the back of the room, seemed to be reading something on his phone, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the information. This is completely irrelevant, Karen snapped, trying to regain control of the room. We are here to discuss the future of the community, not your baseless accusations. But the damage was already done. Murmurs spread throughout the room. Several residents were whispering to each other, exchanging looks of disbelief. Karen was losing her grip, and she knew it. As the meeting adjourned without a vote on my property, I made my way to the door, my mind racing. Something had shifted in the room. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. Neighbors who had previously avoided me were now looking at me with a new sense of respect, even admiration. Outside, I was met by Douglas and his wife, Stephanie. They hurried over to me, their faces filled with concern. That was brave, Stephanie whispered, but be careful. Karen doesn't give up easily. I'm not worried, I said, though their worried expressions made me uneasy. I've got the law on my side, and I'm not backing down. That night, as I tried to calm my nerves, I received an unexpected email from my lawyer. It was a brief message with one line that made my stomach drop. I've just seen a notice for an HOA inspection at your property. Be ready. I immediately checked my security system. Someone was coming, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. As if on cue, the next morning I received a notice of an emergency inspection scheduled for my home. It was signed by Karen Thompson herself. This wasn't just an inspection. This was a setup. I woke up early the next morning, already feeling the weight of what was about to happen. The email notification from my lawyer was still fresh in my mind. An HOA inspection scheduled for my home. The notice mentioned fire hazards, but I had already checked the electrical system. Everything was fine. I had recently had the system upgraded by a certified professional, and it had passed the inspection with flying colors. As I stood by the window watching the quiet neighborhood, a sense of unease began to settle over me. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what Karen was up to, but I could feel the tension in the air. By 7 a.m., I heard the first knock on the door. I opened it to find 3 men standing on my doorstep, all wearing the familiar HOA polo shirts. Karen hovered behind them, a look of satisfaction on her face. Mr. Harrison, the tallest man said, flashing what looked like a homemade badge. We're here to conduct a mandatory safety inspection. I immediately felt my hackles rise. Mandatory? I repeated, my voice calm but firm. I wasn't given proper notice of this inspection. My lawyer advised me no inspections can take place without prior notice. The man attempted to push past me, but I stopped him with a hand on the door. I'll be recording everything, I said, making it clear that I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. Karen stepped forward, her voice laced with feigned concern. We just need to check for any potential fire hazards. A concerned neighbor reported sparks from your roof line, she said, avoiding my gaze. I knew this was nothing more than a fabricated excuse. I had solar panels installed by certified professionals, and the city had approved them. But causing a scene would only escalate things, so I relented, though I made it clear I would accompany them for the duration of the inspection. As they began poking around the house, I followed closely, watching their every move. One of the inspectors seemed especially interested in my electrical panel. He kept disappearing into rooms alone, and I found myself growing more suspicious with each passing minute. Karen, meanwhile, took photos of everything. Some of the shots were clearly intended to capture personal items that had nothing to do with safety. "Your solar panels aren't up to code," Karen declared, staring at my roof through the bedroom window. "That's ridiculous," I countered. "They were installed by certified professionals and approved by the city. I have the paperwork to prove it." Karen dismissed my rebuttal with a wave of her hand. "City approval doesn't mean HOA approval," she said smugly. "Those panels are a reflective hazard. Neighbors have complained about glare." "Which neighbors?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "That's confidential," Karen responded sharply. The inspection dragged on for what felt like hours. They inspected my garden, my fountain, my roofline, all under the guise of safety. But it was clear to me that they were looking for any excuse to violate my property. When they finally left, I was left with a feeling of foreboding. I immediately checked my security cameras to review the footage of the inspection. The footage confirmed my suspicions. One of the inspectors had lingered at my electrical panel, blocking the view of what he was doing. I called Douglas immediately. "Has anyone from the HOA ever inspected your home for fire hazards?" I asked. "Never," he replied. "That's not even within their authority. Electrical inspections require licensed professionals, not HOA volunteers." I felt my anxiety spike. This wasn't just a random inspection. It was part of something much bigger, something much more dangerous. I took action. I called an electrician and had him inspect the entire system. His assessment confirmed my worst fears. Someone had tampered with my breaker box. There were signs of deliberate manipulation, as though someone had overloaded the system. The electrician advised me to report it to the police. It could have started a fire. That afternoon, I filed another police report, this time with the electrician's assessment. The officer seemed more concerned this time, but he still made it clear that without clear evidence of who had done it, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I hire private security to protect myself. Later that evening, as I sat in my living room, going over the police report and my security footage, I received an alarming notification. My HOA fines had quadrupled. The reason? Continued non-compliance and safety hazards. The total now reached almost $10,000. I tried calling the management company, but as usual, I got nowhere. My lawyer advised me that while the fines were almost certainly illegal, fighting them would be a lengthy and costly process. That evening, Karen hosted a community safety meeting at her house. I wasn't invited, but Douglas attended and sent me text updates throughout the evening. "They're talking about your house being a hazard," he texted. Karen's showing doctored photos, making it look run down. I sat back, seething. What else? Her brother just suggested that problem properties should be subject to community acquisition through eminent domain, he replied. "They're actually discussing forcing you out." I spent that night researching HOA laws and the concept of eminent domain. They couldn't legally do what they were threatening, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try something else. The next morning, I received the final blow. A notice of an emergency inspection for my home, citing a gas leak as the cause. I knew this was a fake complaint, designed to gain access to my home. My suspicions were confirmed when I checked my security system. The footage showed Karen and two board members entering my house, tools in hand and going directly to my electrical panel. They had tampered with it again. It was clear now. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were trying to destroy me. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. The night after receiving the notice of the emergency inspection, I barely slept. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. I had been targeted, harassed, manipulated, and now sabotaged, and I knew the stakes were higher than ever. I could feel it in my gut. Something bad was coming. Something worse than any of their petty violations or underhanded tactics. I spent the early morning hours taking precautions. I backed up every important document I could think of, stored files in the cloud, and took photos of every valuable item in my house. I knew that if I didn't prepare now, I might lose everything. Around noon, I called my insurance company to verify the coverage on my home, especially regarding fire damage. "Absolutely," the agent assured me. "Your premium is paid in full, and you have comprehensive coverage for fire, flood, and natural disasters. You're fully protected." I hung up the phone, but the pit in my stomach didn't ease. I decided to take extra security measures. I installed additional cameras and motion sensors, determined not to let anything happen to my home without recording it. Later that day, as the sun began to set, I noticed Karen and her brother parked a few streets away, watching my property. They didn't see me looking, but I knew they were up to something. They always were. I debated moving my vintage Corvette into a secure garage, but I didn't want to show fear. I couldn't let them see me back down. That evening, I met with Stephanie and Douglas Miller. We had dinner at their house, and over the course of the evening, the conversation turned to the increasing tension in the neighborhood. Stephanie seemed uneasy. "We should have warned you sooner about Karen," she said softly, pouring more wine into my glass. "She's been getting worse." "Worse?" I asked. "Last year, the Williams family had their garden destroyed overnight," she said. "No proof it was Karen, but everyone knew. My security system would catch anything like that if it happened to you." "Have there been other instances like that?" I asked. Douglas leaned in, lowering his voice. "Tyler Jenkins stood up to her at a meeting last summer. 2 weeks later, a pipe burst in his home while he was on vacation. Water damage destroyed everything. His house sold to Karen's brother at a huge loss. That night, as I prepared to go to bed, I felt uneasy. The Miller's warning had struck a nerve. Something was coming. I just didn't know what. At 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a security alert. Someone was near my electrical box again. I quickly pulled up the live feed from my cameras and watched in horror as a hooded figure tampered with something near my breaker box. My heart raced, and without thinking, I dialed 911. But by the time I got downstairs and grabbed a flashlight, the intruder was gone. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I explained what had happened, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They were concerned, but they couldn't do much without knowing who the person was. They advised me to hire private security. It was clear to me that the situation was escalating. The next morning, I had an electrician come over to inspect the system. His findings were worse than I'd feared. Someone had tampered with my breaker box. There were clear signs that it had been deliberately overloaded. The electrician told me it could have caused a serious fire. "This wasn't an accident," he said, shaking his head. "Someone deliberately messed with your system." I felt sick. This was no longer just harassment. It was sabotage. They were trying to destroy me, and they were willing to go to any lengths to do it. I filed a police report, but they told me there wasn't much they could do. I had no proof of who had done it. The officer suggested that I keep monitoring the situation and hire additional security. That afternoon, I received another bombshell. My HOA fines had quadrupled. The new reason? Continued non-compliance and safety hazards. The total now stood at $10,000. I was done. This was beyond ridiculous. But Karen wasn't finished with me. That night, she hosted a community safety meeting at her house. I wasn't invited, of course, but Douglas attended and texted me updates. "They're talking about your house being a hazard to the neighborhood," he texted. "Karen's showing doctored photos of your property, making it look run down." "I'm not surprised," I replied. Her next move was even more dangerous. Douglas texted me again, this time with more chilling news. Her brother just suggested that problem properties should be subject to community acquisition through eminent domain. Douglas wrote, "They're actually discussing forcing you out." That was it. I couldn't let them get away with this any longer. They had crossed a line. I spent the rest of the night researching HOA laws and eminent domain. There was no way they could legally do what they were threatening, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try something else. The next morning, I got a call from my insurance agent. "Mr. Harrison, we've received the report about the fire at your property," the agent said. "We'll be starting the investigation shortly." I didn't need to hear more. I knew what had happened. The fire wasn't an accident. It was arson. When I received the news that evening, I was hit with a wave of disbelief. My house, my home, the one I had worked so hard for, was gone. The fire had started in my office, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, the flames had already spread through the upper floors. I stood there staring at the ruins, feeling a deep emptiness wash over me. But even as I felt the devastation of losing everything, there was a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. As the firefighters fought to control the blaze, I could see Karen standing across the street. She wasn't offering help. She wasn't calling emergency services. She wasn't even concerned. She was smiling. It wasn't the smile of someone relieved that the fire was under control. It was the smile of someone who believed they had won. But I wasn't finished yet. The next few days passed in a blur. My home was reduced to nothing but ash and smoldering rubble. The fire department had managed to control the blaze, but it was clear that my beautiful mansion was gone. The memories of 20 years of hard work, dedication, and love, everything my wife and I had built, had been consumed by flames. But amid the grief and anger, something in me shifted. I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let Karen and her corrupt HOA take everything from me without a fight. The insurance company was my first call. As I expected, they assured me that they would investigate the fire. Preliminary investigation shows that the fire may have started from an electrical fault, the agent explained. Though I wasn't fooled. I knew someone had deliberately tampered with my system to cause this disaster. The fire was no accident. It was part of their plan. Your policy was changed 3 weeks ago, the agent added, and I froze. We're sorry, but the new policy excludes fire damage. That was when I knew for sure. Karen and her cronies had orchestrated everything. They had made sure I had no recourse, no way to rebuild without enduring more suffering. They had planned my destruction meticulously, but they had made a crucial mistake. They hadn't accounted for my resolve, or the resources I had at my disposal. The next day, I hired a private investigator to look into the fire and the events leading up to it. I wanted to know exactly what happened, who was involved, and how deep this conspiracy went. I needed evidence, and I needed it fast. While the investigation began, I turned my focus to something else. Revenge. Not the kind of revenge where I simply ruined their lives or sought vengeance in a petty way. No, I was going to dismantle their corrupt world piece by piece and expose them for who they really were. I had spent the last few weeks researching the HOA and its practices, and what I found shocked me to the core. The HOA wasn't run by the residents, as I had assumed. It was managed by a private company called Evergreen Community Management, which handled dozens of neighborhoods in the area. The homeowners had almost no power, and the real decisions were being made by a small group of investors behind the scenes. Karen, in her role as the HOA president, was just a puppet, an eager, willing pawn doing the bidding of those who had no problem using corruption and coercion to line their pockets. What I discovered next was the key to taking everything away from them. Evergreen Community Management was privately held, and one of the investors was looking to sell his 30% stake in the company. It wasn't a controlling interest, but it was enough to get my foot in the door. The price for the stake was $6 million, a small price to pay to secure my revenge, and more importantly, to take control of the very organization that had ruined my life. I didn't hesitate. I made the purchase through a shell company, keeping my identity secret. No one knew I was the buyer, not even the other investors. I wanted them to feel the shock of realizing that they had just sold the very company that had been pulling the strings in their little fiefdom. As the ink dried on the deal, I received a certified letter from the HOA. They demanded that I clear the debris from my burned property within 10 days or face daily fines of $500. The audacity of it took my breath away. Karen had the gall to send me this letter, demanding that I clean up after her carefully orchestrated destruction of my life. That was the moment I realized I was ready. The stage was set, and it was time to expose the truth. 3 days later, Pinecrest Gardens residents packed into the community center for an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda? Discussing the unfortunate fire and the plans for my property. I slipped in quietly and took a seat in the back row, blending in with the other residents. No one paid attention to me. They were all too focused on Karen as she took the podium, still acting like she was in charge. As we all know, Karen began, clicking through a slideshow of my property, the Winters property has become an eyesore. We can't allow this to affect our property values any longer. We need to take action. I stood up slowly, letting my presence be felt. The room fell silent. Karen's eyes widened when she saw me standing there. I have a question, I said, my voice calm and steady. Under what authority does the HOA plan to purchase my property? I haven't put it up for sale. Karen recovered quickly, trying to regain control. The HOA bylaws allow for property acquisition when an owner abandons their responsibilities. You haven't cleared the debris from your property, so we have no choice but to act. I nodded thoughtfully. Interesting interpretation, I said, pulling a folder from my briefcase. But there's been a change in management. That might affect your plans. Karen looked at me, confusion creeping across her face. What are you talking about? I purchased a 30% stake in Evergreen Community Management 3 days ago, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. As the largest single shareholder, I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. The future of this HOA is now in my hands. Gasps echoed throughout the room. The members of the board exchanged nervous glances. Karen's face drained of color as she grabbed the papers from my hands, trembling. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Oh, it's very real," I replied. "And my first order of business will be a full audit of all HOA finances and activities for the past 5 years. I'll be looking into the circumstances surrounding the fire at my property as well." The room erupted into chaos. Some of the residents looked shocked, while others seemed to have suspected something all along. Karen tried to shout over the noise, but her words were drowned out by the growing murmurs of doubt among the neighbors. As the meeting descended into disorder, I smiled. This was just the beginning. I had the leverage, the evidence, and the determination to bring down everything they had built. And the best part? They still didn't know who they were really up against. Tomorrow, I would begin my first steps toward justice. And by the time I was done, Pinecrest Gardens would be a different place entirely. The next morning, I arrived at the Evergreen Community Management Office, the full weight of what I had set in motion sinking in. I was now in control. Karen, her brother, and the board members had no idea what was coming. The moment I stepped into the building, the receptionist gave me a wary look, but I was prepared. I was no longer just a victim. I was the one with the power to change everything. I called an emergency board meeting, and soon the entire Evergreen team was seated in the conference room. The tension was palpable. I could see the fear in Karen's eyes as she tried to regain some sense of control. But it was too late. "Effective immediately," I began, addressing the group, "I'm calling for a full audit of all HOA activities over the past 5 years, including the fines, violations, and all interactions involving Pinecrest Gardens residents. You will cooperate fully or face legal consequences." Karen's face twisted with rage, but I wasn't finished. "I'll also be investigating the circumstances surrounding the fire at my property. Evidence suggests this was no accident, and I will not rest until those responsible are held accountable." The room was silent. No one dared to speak. The investigation into the HOA's finances and activities began immediately. Over the next few weeks, I uncovered everything. The fraudulent complaints, the selective enforcement of rules, the payments from Thompson Development Group to board members, and the systematic destruction of homeowners' lives. But the most damning evidence came from Karen's private files, where I discovered her plan to force out enough homeowners so that her brother could develop a commercial complex on our residential land. It was all there, laid out in black and white. With this evidence in hand, I took action. I filed a formal complaint with the state's Attorney General's office, exposing the corruption and the criminal activities within the HOA. Karen and several board members were arrested, charged with fraud, extortion, and arson. Her brother, too, was implicated in the scheme. The investigation sent shockwaves through the community, and soon homeowners who had been wronged by the HOA began coming forward to reclaim their properties and receive restitution. But the battle wasn't just about revenge, it was about creating something better. As the dust settled, I turned my focus to rebuilding Pinecrest Gardens, not as it had been, but as it should be, a true community. I worked with the remaining residents, those who had supported me, and began transforming the neighborhood from the ground up. The Thompson Property Development Company, which I had purchased during the investigation, was now being used for affordable housing initiatives in areas that truly needed help. As the months went by, things began to change. New leadership emerged in the community, and the HOA was restructured under the principles of transparency and fairness. The bylaws were rewritten to ensure that no one would ever have to face the kind of persecution that I had. The old guard was gone, and in their place was a renewed sense of cooperation and mutual respect. The residents of Pinecrest Gardens came together like never before. Block parties became a regular event, and community meetings were filled with laughter and collaboration rather than fear and division. The scars from the past were still there, but they were healing. And through it all, I had learned a crucial lesson, one that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Lesson from the story. When life throws its worst at you, when those in power seem determined to destroy everything you've worked for, it's easy to fall into despair. But the real power comes not from the position of control, but from your ability to rise again, to rebuild and to fight back, not with anger or violence, but with purpose and conviction. In my case, the corruption that destroyed my life also gave me the opportunity to create something far greater than I had ever imagined. Sometimes our greatest challenges are also our greatest opportunities. They test us, they break us, but they can also forge us into something stronger, something unbreakable. The power of unity, truth, and transparency is unstoppable. When you stand firm in your beliefs, no matter how much power your enemies seem to have, you can dismantle their worlds and build your own. In the end, it wasn't the mansion that mattered. It was the community. It was the relationships we built, the justice we fought for, and the knowledge that when people stand together, they can overcome even the most corrupt forces. That's the lesson I learned, and the one I hope to pass on to others. Never let the darkness of others steal your light. Stand firm, fight for what's right, and from the ashes you will rise.